Hey everybody, Jimmy Smith doing something a little different today. What it is when PFL absorbed Bellator and did the PFL Champions Bellator versus PFL show, it was fun, good stuff. Bellator went 5-1, but it had a lot of people thinking, what would have happened if the UFC, when they absorbed Strikeforce, had done the same thing? Strikeforce champions versus UFC champions. And I thought about that a bit. And there are some to me, rose-colored glasses when it comes to looking back at Strikeforce. Very entertaining promotion. Great stuff. A lot of Strikeforce fighters went on to do great things in the UFC. But I want to set some ground rules. Right now, what I'm going to do is evaluate the champions at the time when Strikeforce was absorbed by the UFC. Now, they bought it in March 2011. It limped on for a couple more years as an independent promotion, but they took the best talent right away. Early 2011 was when they really took the champions away from Strikeforce. So the champions, when UFC, Zuffa, bought Strikeforce, are the champions I'm going to use, not anybody who won a title after. And what people tend to forget is the guys who did well in Strikeforce, who were Strikeforce guys who did well in the UFC later, weren't champions at the time when they acquired Strikeforce. DC, Verdum, Tyron Woodley, they weren't champions. So I'm using the champions that were Strikeforce champions when the UFC acquired them. So that's number one for the breakdown here. So we start off with the easiest one. Remember, they didn't have divisions below 155 in Strikeforce champions. So the first one, of course, is Gilbert Melendez. Easiest one. Why? He got the only real champion versus champion fight at the time. Gilbert Melendez, who had kind of made a circuit early in his career, Japan, Hawaii, before kind of settling in Strikeforce and becoming a 155-pound champion. Excellent fighter, great record. When he came to the UFC, his first fight in the UFC was against Benson Henderson, the UFC champion. And he lost. Very, very simple. So he was the only one to get kind of an immediate unification fight with Benson Henderson, and he lost that fight. So UFC went 1-0 against Strikeforce. In this hypothetical matchup, it's the only one who wasn't hypothetical. Now, a little bit more on Gilbert Melendez. He was solid. He was well-rounded. He had a great gas tank. The problem is when he went to the UFC, and he did get another title shot against Anthony Pettis, ended up losing by guillotine. He was right there with the elite at 155 in the UFC, but he didn't have that thing that kind of put him over the top. A lot of guys at the top of the UFC were well-rounded, had great gas tanks, and were versatile, and all these things. And he was a tough guy, but he didn't have that thing that kind of put him over the top and made him maybe even a fight above the UFC champions of that time, or the UFC elite at that time. So he was right there with him, but he didn't have that thing to put him over the top. In a crowded 155-pound division, it's always crowded. But so Gilbert Melendez had two opportunities, never won a title in the UFC. So moving up, 170 pounds. The champ, this is another easy one. The champ at the time when Strikeforce was absorbed was Nick Diaz. The champ at the time when they absorbed Strikeforce, GSP. For people who don't remember, Nick Diaz fought GSP and lost a lopsided unanimous decision. That was after he lost to Carlos Condit. So he actually fought GSP coming off a loss. I've never been enamored with the Diaz brothers in terms of, I think they're very entertaining. They're a lot of fun. They're great. I'll pay to watch them every single time. Neither guy is truly great in that they never had great records in the UFC. They were both vulnerable to anybody who would take them down and put them on their butt. Nick and Nate have a problem with any standout wrestler. Gives them difficulty. The problem with 170 pounds in the UFC is it's full of standout wrestlers. So Nick, I never thought was going to get over the hump and be a champion. If you put him against another striker, he's going to have an entertaining fight every single time. But the only guy to really outstrike him was Joe Diesel Riggs. Was the only guy to really stand with him and bang and have success was Joe Diesel Riggs. But everybody else, Carl Parisian, Diego Sanchez, all the guys that beat him in the UFC, GSP included in that, took him down. Sean Shirk was a blown-up 155-pounder. You take him down, you can beat him. So he was welterweight champion in Strikeforce. He did get an opportunity at GSP later on. He fails that test. I think it doesn't matter when he gets that. I think he loses to GSP 10 times out of 10. Can't stop the wrestling. So moving up to a very interesting one, which is the middleweight championship. That was held by Luke Rockhold. Now, Luke Rockhold won it in September 2011. They acquired it in March of 2011. So you could put Jacare in that spot. So I'm going with Luke Rockhold. But Luke Rockhold obviously became UFC middleweight champion. At the time when it was acquired, he would have had to fight Anderson Silva right about the Yushin Okami fight-ish. So that's the Anderson Silva we're talking about. So closer to his prime than the Anderson Silva who lost to Chris Weidman. I don't think at that point Luke Rockhold beats Anderson Silva. Please let me know in the comment section if you disagree. Very talented guy. Great striker, very well-rounded, excellent jiu-jitsu, confident, big for the weight class. I still don't think he beats a prime Anderson Silva. Now, that's not an insult. Nobody beats a prime Anderson Silva. But I don't think he beats him at that time. Also, I do believe he's one of those guys that benefited from the time he had in the UFC. If you remember his first time out, he loses to Vitor Belfort by wheel kick, got knocked out, ended up taking on some top names after that before beating Chris Weidman to become champion. So I think the maturation process, we saw a little bit of it in the UFC. Not that he wasn't great in Strikeforce, because he was, but the idea that I think that seasoning and taking on some of those guys, beat Michael Bisping, everybody forgets he's 1-1 against Michael Bisping, made him better. And so he was really prepared to be champion when he beat Chris Weidman to take the title. So I think at that time, 2011 Luke Rockhold does not beat 2011 Anderson Silva. Argue about it if you like. I think it's an intriguing matchup. I would have loved to have seen it, but it didn't happen then. But I don't think he beats a prime Anderson Silva, despite being a great fighter and eventually being UFC champion. Moving on up, light heavyweight championship. Dan Henderson was the last light heavyweight champion in Strikeforce. He beat Rafael Cavalcante. Feijão was his nickname. Dan Henderson did good things at 205, especially early on in Pride. He had knocked out Vanderlei Silva in Pride to become the Pride light heavyweight champion. Just wasn't big enough. And also, John Jones was a champion. So once again, you're running into a prime John Jones. I don't care what Dan Henderson has to say about it in terms of they were supposed to fight. That fight ended up falling out. And then, Chael Sonnen stepped in. John Jones didn't want to fight Chael Sonnen. It's a whole story. But Dan Henderson said, man, I would have had John Jones' number. No, I don't see that at all. Dan Henderson, at his best, in my opinion, 185. He was never a big 205er, a big modern 205er. And I don't think he had the size. I don't think he had the skill set to handle John Jones. Once again, that's not an insult. I don't think anyone anywhere near that time, even now, had the skill set to take on John Jones. That's why he's, really undefeated. But Dan Henderson had a money right hand, excellent Greco-Roman takedown, and a great gas tank. He was a grinder. But I don't think that's enough to beat John Jones. I don't think that's enough to be a real serious contender at 205 in the UFC of that time. 185, remember he got a shot against Anderson Silva, came up short in that, lost by rear naked choke, got another shot against Michael Bisping. A lot of people thought he won that fight, but he had his opportunity at 185. I think that's when he was really at his best as far as his UFC years went. But 205, I don't think he has the size, don't think he has the skills to take on and defeat John Jones, but he was a Strikeforce champion at the time. This one has to be my favorite. Alistair Overeem, who was Strikeforce heavyweight champion. A lot of people forget DC was not the heavyweight champion when the UFC absorbed Strikeforce. He had won a Grand Prix. He was not the champion. So the issue here is Alistair Overeem right now, when I look back on his career, might be one of the top 2 or 3 fighters to never win a title in the UFC. He's got to be up amongst the elite. The problem with Overeem is he had the skill set to beat anyone. One of the best kickboxers in the world in his prime, period, not just in MMA. This guy was kicking ass in K1. He is unbelievable on the feet. Excellent submission game. He has a complete package. Big for the weight class, etc., etc., etc. The problem is Alistair had this tendency to be really up and down in certain fights. He would destroy guys and then not seem to take the next fight seriously and lose. Lost to guys like Travis Brown and Bigfoot Silva, guys who, I'm sorry, aren't in his class in terms of skill set and accomplishment and all these things. And he blows away Brock Lesnar. he just had great performances. And then he would kind of follow them up with performances that were up and down, which is not how champions fight. And I think that's the one thing that kind of kept him out of that, of being a champion, is he just didn't have the consistency at the elite level. Now, of course, he did get a chance against Stipe Miocic, got knocked out in that fight. But it seemed like every time he was ready to do great things, he just didn't quite put it all together. Now, in Strikeforce, he beat Verdum, obviously became UFC heavyweight champion, etc. But the problem is he would have taken on a prime Cain Velasquez. That's who was champion when the UFC acquired Strikeforce. So I don't think anyone beats a prime Cain. Now, the reason I don't put Cain number one all time is Cain had very short runs. He had multiple runs, but they were divided by losses and injuries. And he just couldn't stay healthy long enough to have that run that would put him number one all time, even in the UFC. I put Stipe number one. Heavyweight all time, I put Fedor number one. Why? These guys had really long runs in the heavyweight division. Cain couldn't stay healthy long enough to be number one. But in his prime, when he was firing on all cylinders, almost unbeatable in the heavyweight division. He was absolutely incredible. And unfortunately, as talented as Alistair Overeem is and was and all that stuff, he just runs into a prime Cain. And I think Cain's style is the kryptonite for a guy like Overeem, who needs a fight on the feet, who is inconsistent both in his career and in fights. Cain was just like a machine the whole time. I don't see him beating a prime Cain, but it would have been a dream fight. Oh, I wanted to see it so bad, and it never happened. And so partly because of, Overeem losing at weird times, and partly because Cain dealing with injuries all the time. But that's how I break it down when I look at Strikeforce versus UFC really in their respective primes. When the UFC takes Strikeforce over, I don't see any of the sitting champions. And we all know about Cyborg. They didn't have a division for. Ronda Rousey was kind of grandmothered in and became champion in the UFC. But in competitive weight classes, I don't see the champions of Strikeforce winning against the champions of that time in the UFC. Also, the ones that did win titles later, Tyron Woodley, DC, Verdum, were not champions at the time when they were when Strikeforce was acquired by the UFC. They needed a little more seasoning, or they needed that right combination of things, whatever it was. So champion versus champion at the time, I think UFC runs the table. Let me know if you feel differently in the comment section. Give me a subscribe and a like. Appreciate you.